Well, Mr. President, today the Senate Judiciary Committee continues a most historic hearing with the most qualified nominee to the most consequential court in all of the land. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is unlike any other Supreme Court nominee in American history. But yesterday, she made clear her approach will be the same as the great jurists who came before her, quote, to support and defend the Constitution and the grand experiment of democracy that has endured over these past 246 years. Her record shows that she's up to the task. A clerk for 3 judges, including Justice Breyer, a federal judge for nearly 10 years, and a nominee who commands the endorsements of groups across the political spectrum, including both law enforcement and victims' rights groups. 2 days ago, a cohort of 9 organizations that aid survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence announced their support of Judge Jackson, citing her mix of common sense and thoughtfulness, while adding that, quote, Judge Jackson's rulings reflect the judicial consensus. A few weeks ago, the International Association of Chiefs of Police also celebrated the judge for her dedication to ensuring that our communities are safe and that the interests of justice are served. And in early March, nearly 60 former DOJ officials, including scores of former U.S. attorneys, expressed their confidence that the judge's appreciation for how the criminal justice system works would be a critical addition to the court. Now, when the facts aren't on your side, it's tempting to change the subject. And that's precisely what some Republicans tried to do yesterday. Republicans showed they don't have a plan for addressing Judge Jackson on her merits. So they expended a lot of ink and paper pushing arguments that range from irrelevant to downright misleading. As the judge's confirmation hearing continues today, I'm confident that Americans are going to see right through these flimsy broadsides and focus on the judge's impressive record. So as we enter day 2 of the hearing, I thank my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee who will engage seriously with the judge. And I again express my confidence she is on track for final confirmation before the end of this work period. Now on competition bill and costs. Last night, the Senate cleared the first procedural hurdle on moving forward with jobs and competitiveness legislation that both parties broadly support. In fact, the vote last night was 2 more than the final passage a few months ago on the Senate bill. As a reminder, our long-term goal is to get to a conference committee with the House to finalize a bill we can send to the President. To do that, we must take the legislation that the House sent us, amend it with the bill the Senate passed last summer, USICA, and return it to the House so they can request a conference. That's the elaborate process the Senate requires us to do. This legislation has been dissected and debated for well over a year now, but the need to pass this bill really boils down to 2 simple words, JOBS, jobs, and COSTS, costs. It'll create more jobs by bringing manufacturing back to America from overseas. It will lower costs by taking aim at supply chains, address the chip shortage, and increase innovation. Equally important, this legislation will revive the grand tradition of American innovation that has fueled us and helped our economy grow for much of the 20th century. Our colleagues, our universities, and our startups are some of our country's most prolific job creators. We need to pass this bill to strengthen each of them. Through this bill, we will also address the chip shortage, an especially severe scourge on American families. There's nothing abstract about the shortage of chips. It impacts Americans' abilities to buy cars, refrigerators, phones, and other household items. Americans have faced long delays in finding these goods, and when they're available, they now end up costing a lot more than they did before. By passing bipartisan legislation that invests in domestic chip production, we can help alleviate this vexing chips crisis. America used to lead the world in chip production. We produced about 1/3 of the world's supply. And for the sake of American workers, American consumers, and our national security, we must lead the world again. Passing this bill is critical for achieving that goal. And our efforts in the Democratic Senate are at lowering costs extend to other areas as well. Today, the Commerce Committee will hold a markup on bipartisan legislation by Senators Klobuchar and Thune to reform unfair shipping practices that are clogging up ports, diminishing American exports, and ultimately hurting consumers. This bipartisan shipping bill is exactly the sort of thing the Senate should focus on, because when there's a log jam at the Port of Los Angeles, the tremors are felt by farmers in Minnesota and North Dakota, and ultimately American consumers pick up the tab. Chairman Murray will also hold a hearing today in the Help Committee on another very important issue, lowering the cost of child care and preschool. Today, families pay something more than $10,000 per child on child care, more than some might pay for their annual cost for a mortgage. $10,000 a year is simply out of reach for many families. Not only do our kids suffer when they don't have somewhere safe to stay, families suffer when parents can't enter the workforce, and our country suffers as our economy's productivity is diminished. The example of other countries that have better child care is shown in a greater participation in the workforce, particularly by women. So I thank Chairman Murray and the members of the Help Committee for focusing on this issue. Today's hearing will surely inform the work of Senate Democrats as we work on legislation we can consider which will lower costs for the American people. Finally, Mr. President, on PNTR. This week, members from both parties must work together to take the next step in holding Putin accountable by passing PNTR legislation approved overwhelmingly by the House of Representatives. I believe it passed something like 224 to 8, both Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy in support of the legislation. The clearest message we can send Vladimir Putin is that we are united in passing PNTR that will land a heavy blow against Putin's economy. The PNTR revocation was approved by the House, supported by the President, and would help make Putin pay a heavy price. Time is of the essence to pass PNTR because Putin's savagery against the Ukrainian people grows day by day, and because the President is meeting with the G7 ministers in Europe. On Monday morning, Putin's savagery showed itself once again. Missiles obliterated a 10-story shopping mall in the center of Kyiv, leaving an untold number of people dead in one of the largest attacks on the city to date. In the south, residents of the once thriving port city of Mariupol fight on in what has become the most intense urban warfare that Europe has seen since World War II, and the most brutal at Putin's hands. In the word of one Mariupol resident, quote, "The dead lie in the entrances, on the balconies, and the yards. And you're not scared one bit, because the biggest fear is night shelling. Do you know what night shelling looks like? Like death." That's a person who lives in Mariupol, and these words should ring in all of our ears. It must be unacceptable for any nation so willing to slaughter civilians as Russia to have normal trade relations with the United States and the rest of the world. So the Senate must act quickly to pass PNTR. Every drop of Ukrainian blood demands a response, and the United States has an obligation to stand behind this young democracy. Putin's regime is wicked, and the best message we can send him is to pass the PNTR legislation with overwhelming bipartisan support. I yield the floor. Note the absence of quorum.